In the scorching heat of August 1099, less than a month after Jerusalem's walls ran red with blood, a silver-armored knight stood on a dusty plain south of the Holy City and watched the largest army he had ever seen spread across the horizon like a dark sea. The good knight had survived 3 years of hell: starvation at Antioch, the burning march through Anatolia, the slaughter at Jerusalem. And now, when every fiber of his body screamed for rest, for home, for peace, fate demanded one more battle. On August 12th, near the fortress city of Ascalon, 12,000 exhausted Crusaders faced perhaps 25,000 fresh Egyptian soldiers in a clash that would decide whether the conquest of Jerusalem would stand or crumble into dust. This wasn't just another fight for land or glory. This was the final test, the moment when the entire First Crusade would either be vindicated or erased from history. The good knight tightened his grip on his lance, felt the weight of his mail hauberk, pressing down on shoulders that had carried it across a continent, and prepared to charge into the jaws of an emperor. Subscribe to the GoodKnight Stories for more immersive journeys through history's greatest battles, where our eternal knight guides you through the rise and fall of kingdoms with storytelling designed for deep focus, relaxation, or peaceful sleep. Comment below which battle you'd like the good knight to witness next. But for now, settle in and walk with us through that August morning when everything hung in the balance. Chapter 1. The Fragile Crown. The good knight stood on the walls of Jerusalem in the first week of August, his silver armor dulled by dust and dried blood that no amount of scrubbing could fully remove. Below him, the city still reeked of death. 26 days had passed since the Crusaders breached the walls on July 15th, and the streets were only now beginning to lose the stench of the massacre that followed. He had walked through those streets in the aftermath, had seen things that would live in his nightmares forever: the piles of bodies at the Temple Mount, the smoke rising from the synagogue where Jewish families had been burned alive, the rivers of blood that the chroniclers would later claim reached the horses' bridles. He tried not to think about it. The good knight had come to Jerusalem as a pilgrim, driven by a vow made in a stone church in Normandy that felt like a lifetime ago. He had kissed the floor of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, had wept at the tomb of Christ, had felt the weight of his sins lift, or so he had hoped. But the weight of his armor remained, and with it the knowledge that the war was not over. The city was emptying. Every day, more knights and foot soldiers gathered their meager possessions and began the long march to the coast, to Jaffa or Acre, where ships waited to carry them home. Their vows were fulfilled. They had liberated the holy city. What more could God ask of them? The good knight understood the impulse. He felt it himself, the bone-deep exhaustion, the longing for green fields and cool rain, for a world where the sun didn't beat down like a hammer and every shadow didn't hide a potential enemy. But something kept him in Jerusalem. Perhaps it was loyalty to Godfrey of Bouillon, the tall, quiet duke who had refused the title of king but accepted the burden of defending the city. Perhaps it was the knowledge that the conquest was too fragile, too new, to survive without every sword that could be spared. Or perhaps it was simply that he had nowhere else to go. 3 years of war had changed him. The man who had left Normandy no longer existed. The good knight was what remained: a weapon, a survivor, a ghost in silver armor. On the morning of August 9th, the city's fragile peace shattered. The good knight was in the courtyard of the Tower of David, Godfrey's headquarters, when the scouts arrived. They came in hard, their horses leathered with sweat, their faces grim. He watched from the shade of an archway as they dismounted and were rushed into Godfrey's presence. Within minutes, the word spread through the garrison like wildfire. The Egyptians were coming. The good knight felt his stomach tighten. He had heard rumors of a Fatimid response. Everyone had. But rumors were easy to dismiss in the golden haze of victory. Now the rumors had teeth. By midday, the details were known to every man in the city. A massive Egyptian army, commanded by the Vizier al-Afdal Shahanshah himself, had crossed the Sinai and established a forward base at Ascalon, the great fortress city on the coast, less than 50 miles to the southwest. The numbers varied depending on who was telling the story. 20,000, 30,000, 50,000. But the message was clear. The largest army the Fatimid Caliphate could muster was gathering to retake Jerusalem. The good knight stood in the courtyard as the sun climbed toward its zenith and listened to the arguments that erupted among the knights and lords. Some advocated staying in Jerusalem, repairing the walls, and withstanding a siege. Others wanted to abandon the city and retreat to the coast, to the safety of the Crusader-held ports. A few, very few, spoke of marching out to meet the enemy. Godfrey of Bouillon listened to them all in silence. The good knight had fought under Godfrey since Antioch, and had learned to read the duke's moods. Godfrey was not a man of grand gestures or fiery speeches. He was methodical, careful, deeply pious, but beneath that calm exterior was a core of iron. When Godfrey finally spoke, his voice was quiet, but it cut through the noise like a blade. "We march to Ascalon." The courtyard fell silent. "If we wait here," Godfrey continued, "we give them time to prepare, to bring up siege engines to surround us. Jerusalem's walls are broken. We have no food for a long siege. If they blockade us, we starve." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the assembled knights. "But if we strike now, while they are still gathering, still unprepared, we can break them in the open field." "We're outnumbered," someone objected. "By 2 to 1, maybe more." "We've been outnumbered before," Godfrey replied. "At Dorylaeum, at Antioch, at Jerusalem. God has brought us this far. He will not abandon us now." The good knight felt a chill run down his spine. It wasn't the words themselves. He had heard similar speeches 100 times, but the certainty in Godfrey's voice. This wasn't bravado or desperation. Godfrey believed, with every fiber of his being, that God would grant them victory. The good knight wished he could share that certainty. That evening, as the sun set over Jerusalem, the good knight checked his equipment. His hauberk was in decent condition, though several rings near the left shoulder had been damaged at Jerusalem and needed repair. He worked by candlelight in the small room he shared with 3 other knights, using pliers to close the broken links. His helmet, a simple conical design with a nasal bar, had a dent above the left temple, a souvenir from a Turkish mace at Antioch. He couldn't fix it, but it was still serviceable. His sword was his most prized possession. It was a plain weapon, nothing fancy, but the blade was good steel, well balanced, and it had saved his life more times than he could count. He sharpened it with a whetstone, the rhythmic scrape of metal on stone, a meditation that calmed his nerves. His horse was another matter. The destrier he had brought from Normandy had died in Anatolia, and he had gone through 2 more mounts since then. His current horse was a Rouncy, a serviceable but unremarkable animal he had acquired after the fall of Jerusalem. It wasn't bred for war, but it was strong and steady, and that would have to be enough. As he worked, one of his roommates, a Flemish knight named Baldwin, spoke up. "Do you think we'll win?" The good knight didn't look up from his sharpening. "We'd better." "I mean it," Baldwin pressed. "The Egyptians have never faced us in open battle. What if they're stronger than the Turks? What if—" "Then we die," the good knight interrupted, his voice flat. "And Jerusalem falls, and everything we've done for the last 3 years means nothing." He finally looked up, meeting Baldwin's eyes. "So we'd better win." Baldwin fell silent. The good knight returned to his sharpening, but his hands were shaking. Chapter 2. The March South. On the morning of August 10th, the army of Jerusalem marched out through the Jaffa Gate. The good knight rode near the center of the column, surrounded by the knights of Godfrey's household. The streets were lined with the few civilians who remained in the city, mostly Eastern Christians who had survived the massacre, and they watched in silence as the army passed. Some made the sign of the cross. Others simply stared, their faces unreadable. The good knight felt their eyes on him and wondered what they saw. A liberator, a conqueror, a foreign invader who had brought nothing but blood and fire? He didn't know anymore. The army was smaller than he had hoped. Godfrey had managed to scrape together perhaps 5,000 men, 1,200 knights, and the rest infantry. A mix of spearmen and crossbowmen. It was a fraction of the host that had besieged Jerusalem, and a tiny force compared to the Egyptian army waiting at Ascalon. But it was all they had. The march south was brutal. The August sun was merciless, beating down on the column with an intensity that turned the male hauberks into ovens. The good knight felt the sweat pouring down his back, soaking the padded gambeson he wore under his armor. His mouth was dry, his lips cracked. The water in his canteen was warm and tasted of leather, but he rationed it carefully. He had learned the hard way, on the march to Jerusalem, what happened when you drank too much too fast. The road to Ascalon followed the coast, winding through low hills and cultivated fields. In peacetime, this would have been rich farmland, but 3 years of war had taken their toll. Many of the fields were abandoned, the crops withered or burned. The villages they passed were empty, the inhabitants fled or dead. The good knight rode in silence, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of the enemy. The landscape was deceptive, rolling hills and scattered groves of olive and sycamore trees that could hide an ambush. But the scouts reported no contact. The Egyptians were still at Ascalon, waiting. By midday, the heat was unbearable. Godfrey called a halt near a small stream, and the men dismounted to water the horses and refill their canteens. The good knight knelt by the stream and splashed water on his face, feeling the blessed coolness against his sun-burned skin. For a moment, he allowed himself to close his eyes and imagine he was somewhere else, anywhere else. The moment didn't last. "On your feet!" a sergeant barked. "We're moving!" The good knight hauled himself upright, his knees protesting, and climbed back into the saddle. His horse snorted and tossed its head, as unhappy with the heat as he was. As the column resumed its march, the good knight noticed something strange. The mood of the army was shifting. When they had left Jerusalem, the men had been tense, nervous, their faces tight with fear. But as the day wore on, a different energy began to build. It started with the priests and monks who accompanied the army, chanting psalms as they marched. The words were in Latin, incomprehensible to most of the foot soldiers, but the rhythm was hypnotic, comforting. Then someone began to sing. It was a hymn the good knight recognized, Salve Regina, a prayer to the Virgin Mary. Other voices joined in, and soon the entire column was singing, the sound rising above the tramp of boots and the jingle of harness. The good knight didn't sing. He had never been comfortable with public displays of piety, but he felt the effect of the music, the way it bound the men together, transforming them from a collection of frightened individuals into something larger, something unified. By the time they made camp that evening, the fear had been replaced by something else. Not confidence, exactly, but a kind of grim determination. They were marching to their deaths, perhaps, but they would march together, and they would make the Egyptians pay for every inch of ground. The good knight lay on his bedroll that night, staring up at the stars, and tried to sleep. But sleep wouldn't come. His mind kept circling back to the same question. What if they lost? He had survived so much: the ambush at Dorylaeum, the starvation at Antioch, the desperate assault on Jerusalem's walls. He had seen men he respected, men he loved, cut down by Turkish arrows or crushed by falling stones. He had killed more men than he could count, had felt the resistance of flesh and bone against his blade, had watched the light fade from their eyes. And for what? To die on a dusty plain in a land that would never be home? The good knight rolled onto his side and closed his eyes, forcing the thoughts away. There was no point in dwelling on what might happen. Tomorrow would come whether he was ready or not. Chapter 3. The Junction. On the morning of August 11th, the army reached the Sorek River, a small watercourse that marked the boundary between the hill country and the coastal plain. The good knight was watering his horse when the shout went up. "Riders approaching!" He looked up, his hand instinctively moving to his sword, but the tension eased when he recognized the banners. It was Raymond of Toulouse, the Count of Provence, leading his contingent south to join Godfrey's force. The good knight felt a surge of relief. Raymond was one of the most powerful lords of the Crusade, and his arrival meant reinforcements, perhaps another 3,000 or 4,000 men. The odds were still against them, but at least they wouldn't be quite so hopelessly outnumbered. But as Raymond's column drew closer, the good knight noticed something odd. The count's face was dark with anger, and the knights around him looked equally displeased. When Raymond dismounted and strode over to Godfrey, the two men exchanged words that the good knight couldn't hear, but the body language was clear. This was not a happy reunion. Later, the good knight learned the cause of the tension. Raymond and Robert of Normandy had initially refused to join Godfrey's march, suspecting it was a ploy to consolidate the Duke's power. It was only when their own scouts confirmed the presence of the Egyptian army that they had grudgingly agreed to march south. Even now, Raymond was furious at being, as he saw it, manipulated into supporting Godfrey. The good knight shook his head in disgust. Even now, with an enemy army less than a day's march away, the lords of the Crusade couldn't put aside their petty rivalries. But whatever Raymond's feelings, his presence doubled the size of the army. By the time the combined force resumed its march, the good knight estimated they had perhaps 10,000 to 12,000 men, still outnumbered, but no longer suicidally so. As the army moved south, the landscape began to change. The hills gave way to flat, sandy plains dotted with orchards and cultivated fields. In the distance, the good knight could see the Mediterranean, a line of brilliant blue against the horizon. The air smelled of salt and dust. And then, in the late afternoon, they saw the dust cloud. It rose from the south, a vast, roiling column that stretched across the entire width of the plain. At first, the good knight thought it was a sandstorm, but as he watched, he realized the cloud was moving, not with the random chaos of wind, but with purpose, direction. "What is that?" Baldwin asked, his voice tight with fear. The good knight didn't answer. He was too busy trying to estimate the size of the force that could raise such a cloud. 10,000 men? 20,000? More? A scout galloped up to Godfrey, and the two men conferred briefly. Then Godfrey raised his hand, and the column came to a halt. "Dismount!" The order came down the line. "We camp here for the night." The good knight swung down from his saddle, his legs stiff and aching. Around him, the men began to set up camp, but the usual chatter and banter were absent. Everyone was staring at the dust cloud, watching it grow larger as the sun sank toward the horizon. As the good knight unsaddled his horse, a commotion broke out near the front of the column. He looked up to see a group of Crusader scouts dragging several prisoners into camp, Egyptian soldiers by the look of their clothing and weapons. The prisoners were brought before Godfrey, and the interrogation began. The good knight was too far away to hear the questions or answers, but he watched the prisoners' faces, saw the fear in their eyes, and knew they were talking. Within the hour, the word spread through the camp. The Egyptian army was encamped just outside the walls of Ascalon, less than 10 miles. To the south, they were resting, preparing to march on Jerusalem in the morning. They had no idea the Crusaders were so close. The good knight felt his pulse quicken. A surprise attack. A dawn assault. It was risky, insanely risky, but it might be their only chance. As darkness fell, Godfrey called a council of the lords and senior knights. The good knight was not important enough to attend, but he heard the results soon enough. The decision was made. They would march through the night and attack at dawn. The camp was a hive of quiet, controlled activity. Men checked their weapons, tightened the straps on their armor, whispered prayers. The priests moved through the ranks, offering blessings and absolution. The good knight knelt before a Benedictine monk and confessed his sins, or at least the ones he could bring himself to speak aloud. The monk's hand was cool on his forehead as he pronounced the words of forgiveness. The good knight rose, feeling no lighter, no more at peace, but at least he had done what was expected. As the moon rose, the army formed up in marching order, but this time there was no singing, no chanting. Godfrey had ordered absolute silence. The only sounds were the creak of leather, the jingle of harness, and the soft thud of hooves on the sandy soil. The good knight rode near the center of the column, his lance resting across his saddle, his shield slung on his back. The night was cool, almost cold after the heat of the day, and he shivered despite his armor. Around him the other knights were silent, their faces pale in the moonlight. As they marched, the good knight noticed something strange. The road was lined with animals, cattle, sheep, goats, even camels. At first he thought they were wild, but then he realized they were too docile, too well fed. These were the herds intended to supply the Egyptian army, left to graze in the fields around Ascalon. The Crusaders began to round up the animals, driving them along with the column. The good knight wasn't sure what the plans was, perhaps to use them as a mobile food supply, or perhaps to deny them to the enemy. But as the herds grew larger, he noticed something else. The animals were kicking up dust, adding to the cloud raised by the marching army. In the darkness, it was impossible to see how large the cloud was, but the good knight imagined it must be enormous. He smiled grimly. If the Egyptians had lookouts on the walls of Ascalon, they would see that dust cloud in the moonlight and assume the Crusader army was far larger than it actually was. It was a deception, but an accidental one. Or perhaps, as the priests would say, a miracle. The march continued through the night. The good knight's eyes grew heavy, and he found himself nodding in the saddle, jerking awake every few minutes. Around him, other knights were doing the same. The horses plodded forward, their heads low, as exhausted as their riders. And then, as the first hint of grey appeared on the eastern horizon, the order came down the line. "Halt! Dismount! Prepare for battle!" The good knight's heart began to pound. This was it. No more marching, no more waiting. In a few minutes, he would either be victorious or dead. He swung down from his saddle and began to check his equipment one last time. His hauberk was secure, the straps of his helmet tight under his chin. His sword was loose in its scabbard, ready to draw. His lance was in his hand, the weight familiar and comforting. Around him, the army was forming into battle lines. The infantry moved to the front, their spears and crossbows ready. Behind them, the knights mounted up, forming into their conrois, the small tactical units that would charge together. The good knight climbed back into his saddle and took his place in the line. To his left was Baldwin, his face pale but determined. To his right was a Norman knight he didn't know, a young man with a wispy beard and eyes that looked too wide, too frightened. Godfrey rode along the line, his voice calm and steady. "Remember, No war cries until we strike. We want surprise. We want them to wake up to the sound of our lances in their chests. The good knight felt a cold knot of fear in his stomach, but he pushed it down. There was no room for fear now, only action. The sky was growing lighter. The good knight could see the outline of the city of Ascalon in the distance, its walls dark against the dawn. And between the city and the Crusader army, spread across the plain, was the Egyptian camp. It was enormous. Thousands of tents arranged in rough clusters, with banners and standards rising above them. The good knight could see the flicker of campfires, hear the faint sounds of men stirring, horses whinnying. They had no idea what was coming. Godfrey raised his hand. The entire army tensed, waiting, and then his hand dropped. "Charge!" The good knight dug his heels into his horse's flanks, and the animal surged forward. Around him, 1,200 knights did the same, and the ground began to shake with the thunder of hooves. For the first few seconds, there was only the sound of the charge, the pounding of hooves, the creak of leather, the rattle of mail. The good knight leaned forward in his saddle, his lance couched under his arm, the point aimed at the mass of tents ahead. And then the Egyptians saw them. The first shouts of alarm went up from the edge of the camp. Men stumbled out of their tents, half-dressed, unarmed, their faces slack with shock. Some tried to run. Others stood frozen, unable to process what they were seeing. The good knight picked his target, a cluster of men near a large tent, scrambling to grab weapons. He aimed his lance at the nearest man, a soldier in a quilted tunic who was fumbling with a spear. The impact was brutal. The lance punched through the man's chest with a wet crunch, and the cuts into sits. Good knight felt the shock travel up his arm. The man's body was lifted off the ground and flung backward, and the lance snapped, the shaft splintering in the good knight's hand. He dropped the broken lance and drew his sword, the blade hissing free of the scabbard. Around him, the other knights were crashing into the camp, their lances shattering on shields and bodies, their horses trampling men who couldn't get out of the way fast enough. The outer edge of the camp disintegrated. The lightly armed soldiers and camp followers who had been sleeping near the perimeter broke and ran, screaming in terror. The good knight urged his horse forward, slashing down at a man who tried to grab his reins. The sword bit into the man's shoulder, and he fell away with a shriek. The good knight's world narrowed to a tunnel of violence. He saw flashes, a tent collapsing as a horse crashed through it, a man on fire running blindly into the melee, a knight beside him taking an arrow in the throat and toppling from his saddle. But there was no time to process any of it, no time to think. There was only the next target, the next swing of the sword, the next desperate effort to stay alive. The Crusaders drove deeper into the camp, and the resistance began to stiffen. The good knight saw a line of soldiers forming ahead. Sudanese troops, he realized, recognizing their dark skin and the distinctive iron-tipped spears they carried. These men were not panicking. They had dropped to one knee, their spears braced against the ground, and as the good knight watched, they raised their bows and loosed a volley. Arrows hissed through the air. The good knight felt one glance off his helmet with a metallic clang that left his ears ringing. Another arrow punched into his shield, the iron head bursting through the wood and stopping inches from his arm. But the charge didn't slow. The knights crashed into the Sudanese line like a wave hitting a breakwater. The good knight's horse reared, its hooves lashing out, and he felt the animal's weight come down on something soft. A spear thrust up at him, and he barely managed to deflect it with his shield. He swung his sword in a wide arc, felt it connect with something, heard a scream. The Sudanese line held for perhaps 30 seconds, and then it broke. The good knight didn't see what caused the collapse, whether it was the sheer momentum of the charge, or the death of an officer, or simply the psychological shock of facing armored knights at close range. But suddenly the line was fragmenting, the soldiers throwing down their weapons and running. The good knight urged his horse forward, chasing the fleeing men. His sword rose and fell, and each time it came away slick with blood. He felt nothing, no triumph, no horror, only a cold, mechanical efficiency. This was what he had been trained for, what 3 years of war had honed him into. A killer. Ahead he saw a large tent, far grander than the others, with a silver pole topped by a golden sphere. The vizier's tent, he realized, the command center of the Egyptian army. A knot of soldiers was forming around the tent, trying to mount a defense. The good knight saw Robert of Normandy leading a wedge of knights directly at them. He spurred his horse to join the attack. The melee around the vizier's tent was the fiercest fighting of the battle. The Egyptian guards were well armed and well trained, and they fought with the desperation of men who knew their lives depended on holding the line. The good knight found himself in a swirling chaos of horses and men, swords and spears, screams, and the wet sounds of steel cutting flesh. A soldier lunged at him with a spear. The good knight twisted in the saddle, and the spear point scraped along his mail, the links holding but the force of the blow nearly unseating him. He grabbed the spear shaft with his left hand and yanked, pulling the soldier off balance, then brought his sword down on the man's head. The helmet crumpled, and the man dropped. Another soldier, this one wielding a heavy iron flail, swung at the good knight's horse. The flail connected with the animal's shoulder, and the horse screamed and staggered. The good knight felt the saddle tilting, knew he was about to fall, and kicked his feet free of the stirrups. He hit the ground hard, the impact driving the breath from his lungs. For a moment he lay stunned, the world spinning around him. Boots and hooves pounded past, inches from his head. He could hear the clash of steel, the screams of men and horses, but it all seemed distant, muffled. And then survival instinct kicked in. The good knight rolled to his feet, his sword still in his hand, and looked around wildly. His horse was down, thrashing in the dirt, its shoulder a bloody ruin. The soldier with the flail was advancing on him, the weapon raised for another strike. The good knight didn't wait. He lunged forward, inside the arc of the flail, and drove his sword into the man's belly. The blade punched through the quilted armor and sank deep. The soldier's eyes went wide, and he dropped the flail, his hands clutching at the sword. The good knight twisted the blade and pulled it free, and the man collapsed. Around him, the defense was crumbling. Robert of Normandy had reached the vizier's tent and was hacking at the ropes, bringing the structure down. Other knights were looting the interior, emerging with armfuls of silk and gold. And then someone shouted, "The vizier is fleeing!" The good knight looked up and saw a figure in rich robes, surrounded by a handful of guards, running toward the city gates. Al-Afdal himself, abandoning his army. The sight seemed to break the last remnants of Egyptian resistance. All across the camp, soldiers were throwing down their weapons and running, toward the city, toward the sea, toward anywhere that offered a chance of escape. The battle had become a rout. The good knight stood in the wreckage of the Egyptian camp, his chest heaving, his sword dripping blood. Around him, the Crusaders were pursuing the fleeing enemy, cutting them down as they ran. The screams of the dying filled the air, mixing with the triumphant shouts of the victors. He should have felt something, relief, joy, triumph, but all he felt was exhaustion. A riderless horse trotted past, and the good knight grabbed its reins. It was an Arabian, smaller and lighter than his lost Rouncy, but it would do. He hauled himself into the saddle and looked around, trying to orient himself. The Egyptian camp was in chaos. Tents were burning, sending columns of black smoke into the morning sky. Bodies lay everywhere, hundreds of them, perhaps thousands. The good knight saw Crusader infantry moving through the wreckage, finishing off the wounded and looting the dead. To the south, he could see the walls of Ascalon. The gates were open, and a stream of Egyptian soldiers was pouring through, desperate to reach the safety of the city. Crusader knights were pursuing them, cutting down the stragglers. The good knight urged his horse forward, joining the pursuit. He wasn't sure why. The battle was won, the enemy broken. But something drove him on, a need to see it through to the end. As he rode, he passed scenes of horror. Egyptian soldiers trapped against the walls of the city, crushed by the press of their own comrades trying to force their way through the gates. Men drowning in the sea, weighed down by their armor as they tried to swim to the Egyptian ships anchored offshore. Bodies hanging from the branches of sycamore trees, shot down by Crusader archers as they tried to hide in the foliage. The good knight felt sick. This wasn't battle. This was slaughter. He reined in his horse near the edge of the sea and watched as Raymond of Toulouse's knights drove a group of Egyptian soldiers into the surf. The Egyptians floundered in the waves, their arms flailing, their screams cut short as they went under. The knights waded in after them, their swords rising and falling, the water turning red. The good knight turned away. By mid-morning, it was over. The Egyptian army had ceased to exist as a fighting force. Those who had made it into Ascalon were safe behind the city's walls, but they were a fraction of the original host. The rest were dead, captured, or scattered across the countryside. The good knight rode back to the camp, or what was left of it. The Crusaders were already looting, tearing through the tents and baggage train, seizing everything of value. He saw knights staggering under the weight of silk robes and golden vessels. He saw foot soldiers driving herds of camels and horses. He saw priests carefully packing up the vizier's personal Quran, a prize to be sent back to Europe as proof of the victory. The good knight dismounted and walked through the wreckage, his legs unsteady. He found the remains of his own horse, already stripped of its saddle and bridle by scavengers. He stood over the animal for a moment, feeling a pang of guilt. The horse had carried him faithfully, and this was its reward, to die on a foreign battlefield, its body left to rot in the sun. He moved on. Near the center of the camp, he found the vizier's tent, or what was left of it. The structure had been torn down, the silk trampled into the dirt. But the silver pole with the golden sphere still stood, and a crowd of knights had gathered around it. The good knight pushed his way through and saw Robert of Normandy holding the vizier's personal sword, a magnificent weapon with a curved blade and a hilt encrusted with jewels. "This," Robert declared, holding the sword aloft, "will hang in the church of the Holy Sepulchre, a testament to our victory." The knights cheered. The good knight turned away, feeling hollow. Chapter 6. The Walls of Ascalon. By noon, the looting was largely complete, and Godfrey ordered the army to regroup. The good knight joined the other knights in forming up outside the walls of Ascalon. The city loomed above them, its fortifications massive and imposing. The gates were closed now, the walls lined with archers and soldiers. The good knight could see faces peering down at them from the battlements. Egyptian soldiers, yes, but also civilians, the inhabitants of the city who had watched the destruction of their army from the safety of the walls. And then something unexpected happened. A delegation emerged from the city gates, carrying a white flag. They approached Godfrey and Raymond, and a tense negotiation began. The good knight was too far away to hear the words, but he could see the gestures, the back and forth. After perhaps an hour, the delegation returned to the city, and the Crusader lords gathered for a council. The good knight waited with the other knights. The sun, beating down on his armor, his mouth dry with thirst. Finally, the word came down. The garrison of Ascalon had offered to surrender the city, but only to Raymond of Toulouse. They had heard of Raymond's reputation for honoring terms of surrender, and they refused to hand the city over to Godfrey, fearing a repeat of the massacre at Jerusalem. The good knight felt a flicker of hope. If Ascalon surrendered, the war would truly be over. The kingdom of Jerusalem would be secure, its southern flank protected. But then the argument began. Godfrey, as the ruler of Jerusalem, demanded that the city be surrendered to him. Raymond, insulted and unwilling to strengthen his rival, refused to cooperate. The two men shouted at each other, their voices carrying across the plain, while the rest of the army watched in disbelief. The good knight felt his hope curdle into disgust. They had just won a miraculous victory, had shattered an empire's army, and now they were squabbling over who got the credit. The argument went on for hours, and as it dragged on, the garrison of Ascalon, watching from the walls, began to realize that the Crusaders were divided. Their fear turned to calculation. If the Franks couldn't agree among themselves, perhaps the city could hold out after all. By late afternoon, the gates of Ascalon remained closed. The offer of surrender was withdrawn. Godfrey, furious, ordered an assault. But the army was exhausted, and the siege engines had been left in Jerusalem. The attack was half-hearted, easily repulsed by the defenders. As the sun set, Godfrey called off the assault and ordered the army to withdraw. The good knight rode away from Ascalon, looking back at the city's walls, and felt a profound sense of loss. They had won the battle, but they had lost the war. Chapter 7. The Return. The army marched back to Jerusalem on August the 13th, moving slowly, weighed down by loot and exhaustion. The good knight rode in silence, his new horse, a captured Arabian, stepping carefully over the rocky ground. Around him, the other knights were jubilant, singing songs of victory, boasting about their exploits. But the good knight couldn't share their joy. He kept thinking about the walls of Ascalon, about the opportunity that had slipped through their fingers because of pride and rivalry. When they reached Jerusalem, the city erupted in celebration. The streets were lined with cheering crowds, and the bells of every church rang out in triumph. The true cross was carried in procession to the church of the Holy Sepulchre, and the vizier's sword and standard were placed on the altar as offerings to God. The good knight attended the service, standing at the back of the church, his armor still stained with blood and dust. He listened to the priests sing the Te Deum, the hymn of thanksgiving, and tried to feel grateful. But all he could think about was the faces of the men he had killed. The soldier with the spear, the man with the flail, the countless others who had fallen under his sword. They had been someone's sons, someone's brothers, someone's fathers, and now they were gone, their bodies rotting on a battlefield far from home. Just like he might have been. In the days that followed, the army began to disperse. Robert of Normandy announced he was returning to Europe, his vow fulfilled. Robert of Flanders did the same. Hundreds of knights and thousands of foot soldiers followed their example, marching to the coast to find ships that would carry them home. The good knight considered joining them. He had done what he came to do. He had reached Jerusalem, had fought for the holy city, had survived. He could go home now, back to Normandy, back to a life of peace. But when the time came to leave, he found he couldn't do it. He stood on the walls of Jerusalem one evening, watching the sun set over the city, and realized that he had no home to return to. The man who had left Normandy 3 years ago was dead, killed somewhere on the long road to Jerusalem. The good knight was all that remained, a weapon, a survivor, a ghost in silver armor, and so he stayed. Chapter 8. The Thorn. In the months and years that followed, the good knight learned the true cost of the failure to capture Ascalon. The city remained in Egyptian hands, a Fatimid enclave on the southern border of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Every year, the garrison would sally forth, raiding the surrounding countryside, burning villages, killing settlers. The kings of Jerusalem were forced to build a ring of castles, Ibelin, Blanchgard, Gibelin, to contain the threat. But the raids continued. The good knight fought in many of those skirmishes. He rode patrol along the southern frontier, chasing Egyptian raiders, defending convoys, escorting pilgrims. It was grinding, thankless work, far from the glory of the great battles. He grew older. His hair turned grey, his body accumulated scars. He saw friends die, some in battle, some from disease, some simply from the exhaustion of trying to hold a kingdom together in a hostile land. And always, in the distance, he could see the walls of Ascalon, a constant reminder of what might have been. It would be 54 years before the city finally fell to the Crusaders. The good knight was long gone by then, having moved on to other battles, other wars, other centuries. But he never forgot Ascalon, the victory that should have ended the war and the failure that ensured it would continue. Epilogue. The field. Decades later, the good knight returned to the battlefield of Ascalon. He rode alone, his silver armor dulled by time and weather, his horse a different animal from the one he had ridden that August morning. The plain was empty now, the tents and bodies long since cleared away. The orchards had grown back, the fields were cultivated again. There was no sign that 25,000 men had clashed here, that an empire's army had been destroyed in a single morning. The good knight dismounted and walked across the field, his boots crunching on the sandy soil. He tried to remember where the Egyptian camp had stood, where he had charged, where his horse had fallen. But the landscape had changed, and his memory was uncertain. He stood for a long time, looking south toward the walls of Ascalon, and thought about all the men who had died here, Egyptian and Crusader alike. They had fought for their gods, their kings, their homes, and in the end, what had it mattered? The walls of Ascalon still stood, the war still raged, the killing continued. The good knight climbed back into his saddle and rode away, leaving the field to the ghosts. He had survived Ascalon, as he had survived so many battles before, and would survive so many after. But a part of him, the part that had believed in the righteousness of the cause, in the possibility of a lasting peace, had died on that field. And it would never come back.